So maybe you've been told that your hips are out of alignment or your pelvis is out of alignment and you need to be adjusted or manipulated for it to be put back in place, or you just feel like that area needs to pop and you're not really sure what's happening. We're going to dive into what's going on there, what that adjustment actually does, and what to do instead or in addition to it. So to give a little bit of a background story, I did gymnastics growing up, so a lot of times you do skills on one side, which is your dominant side. I ended up being a beam specialist in college, and I did a lot of aerials or cartwheels without your arms. So I was pushing off my left leg and driving with my right leg repetitively. And after a while, my hips started to feel a little bit funky. So I'm going to show you some exercises later on that I did to kind of help with this, but it definitely kind of feels like your hips are a little bit off. But in my case, I was overusing a group of muscles on one side and then the opposite muscles on the other side. And so it was creating a muscular imbalance from side to side, which caused this feeling.
Common misconception is that it can be out of place. I guess there are some rare exceptions to this, but for the majority of people that it feels out of place and Laura said it felt funky, it doesn't necessarily mean it's out of place. There's only a few millimeters of motion. Some doctors and even some physical therapists still don't even believe that it moves at all. There is, a time of life where it actually starts to fuse, usually around 4th or 5th decade for the majority of people. So to say it's out of place, so to speak, and out of alignment needs to get poked back in place when it's fused is probably not as likely, just based off of just talking theoretically here. And there's some research to support that as well, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it should or shouldn't be manipulated or adjusted, whichever word you want to use. Just don't necessarily think, oh, it's just out of place or out of alignment because it's uncomfortable, and that means that's what I need to get better. So I think that even makes us want to tie into why does it actually feel good? Talking SI specifically is one thing, where we talked about that joint and the minimal millimeters of motion that it has to offer before it fuses later in life for most people. But an easy way of looking at it, I look at it as like a reset button to your nervous system or your brain, where I might even describe it in the clinic as a permission slip. So it's just kind of giving it permission to feel comfortable moving again. The joint itself is focused on a bit too much typically here, where it doesn't just apply to the joint, but a lot of the muscles that are innervated by that nervous system segment from the spine, and also just the surrounding musculature, as well as those motor units get that quick stretch as well. So the short term, you're going to get some chemical reactions, releasing of different neurotransmitters or chemicals, which are also helpful, but we're not going to get into too much detail there. The short term, however, doesn't necessarily always translate to long term.
So the short term release of these chemicals, the short term release of that pressure when you get that chemical reaction causing that pop sound, that doesn't necessarily translate to long term. So the short term, like you actually get a little bit of dopamine release when you do get that cavitation. So that's sometimes why it can be a little bit of addicting for some people as well. And you get that release and that feel good sensation, but it doesn't really change over time. Right, so it goes back to the same thing over and over and over again, which is why you have to keep getting manipulated or adjusted over and over and over again. So that's where we're creating a short-term solution, but not necessarily a long-term solution. And our goal is to not have to keep dealing with this over and over again, so you can actually do things that you enjoy doing without worrying about it.
Yep. And especially with the SI joint, just to oversimplify it, there's really two things that are going to be causing symptoms, if again, oversimplifying here. And number one is, that joint or the muscles around it are stiff and not moving very well, which is what everyone usually thinks of, right? And even if it feels stiff, it doesn't mean that's what it is, right? But number two, and one that's really common, especially in certain populations, anyone really, it just has to be differentiated between the stiffness, or is it a forced closure is the terminology we'll use as physical therapists, where it's more muscle sequencing, activation, etc. So both of them will really present for most people as feeling the same. However, that being said, that's just not necessarily the case, even though the sensation is very similar. Very rarely, there are some patients that are appropriate for SI joint fusions as well. They're pretty successful in my experience when people get them done. But I think, people are very quick to look at a pain that they've been experiencing for a long period of time and think that they might need surgery, or a very severe pain and think that they need surgery. SI joint, I can count on my two hands in over half a decade how many people are actually been appropriate for that.
Do keep in mind though as well with certain populations, this can be an increased incidence for them to actually have SI joint pain, and that really is pregnancy because of those hormone changes and the increased laxity that you're getting. So do keep that in mind. With most people, you don't have a lot of motion, and it's really a diagnosis of exclusion where you have to rule out the hips and the low back first, and a lot of times it's coming from there and referring to the SI joint area.
There's even a research article out there where people with lumbar radiculopathy or sciatica, bulging disc, etc. type symptom radiating down the leg, approximately 2/3 of people actually have an SI joint dysfunction of some kind. And it's probably just related to the fact that that nerve innervates either the muscles around it or, that area from a dermatome standpoint specifically. So very common, even though that might not be the cause of your symptoms, that you're experiencing symptoms there. And that's why this is a joint or area, depending on how you want to look at it, that is really commonly misunderstood.
And a dermatome is just the sensory distribution, so like where you feel that area coming from that nerve root. A lot of people, when they do feel like they need to be adjusted or things like that, can sometimes get this actually on your own doing a muscle energy technique. Not always, but this technique is just engaging those muscles a little bit, getting them going a little bit more.
So really 2 different techniques. This is just trying to keep these as real simple ones that we'll commonly instruct patients to be doing at home on their own if this is kind of what we think is what's causing their symptoms. Without getting too technical with kind of some of the misconceptions you might kind of get taught in PT school about position and things like that. We'll keep it real simple, not even talk sidedness here or anything, just say right or left. We're ignoring that time. The first technique that we'll show is really simple, where it's pretty much going to be, we're just going to keep it as up with one, down with the other. So we're going to be pushing with the legs, where I can do it with my hands, to have one on the front of her thigh and one on the back of her thigh. And you just push into one and push into the other. I prefer typically them not to lift their leg up, because that'll have a tendency to start firing different muscles. And really our goal here is not to create a maximal effort. Our goal here is really just to fire a few muscles sub-max effort. So these are not pushing as hard as you can. The goal is not to fire them remotely anywhere close to as hard as you can. It's just to fire the muscle without contracting other things. You should be able to breathe comfortably while you're doing this. You should not be holding your breath, and if you are, you're going to prevent the muscles from actually creating the pull that you want.
So I typically say like maybe 30% effort, maybe like max 30% effort.
I'll have one hand here, so push it up into this hand and down into this to keep your feet on down. Cool. Deep breath in, deep breath out, and then we'll switch. And we're just going to floss back and forth, again, to keep deep breath in, deep breath out. And what we'll see actually is, depending on the provider you talk to, they might say that it's rotated a specific direction, and they'll encourage you to, only do it one specific direction. In practice, in most research, you're going to find that there's not any deleterious effect of actually just firing both and going both ways. In my experience, it actually helps people contract and relax the muscles. They're doing it purposely, whether, again, just ignoring whether they say that it's rotated a certain direction. But that's with me here, right? Not always going to be here. So there's a very easy way you can do this on your own as well. Laura will show you that.
So just find something to rest your feet up on. And now I can reach here. So now I'm going to push into this hand and drive my heel into whatever you have your feet on. So I'm just pushing into my hand, pushing into the windowsill here. And then now I'm going to switch. So I'm now pushing into my hand with this one and pushing my heel in with this one. And you can do that same thing. So I'm going to feel it in my glutes on this side over here, and then I'm feeling it in my hip flexor on this side over here. And alternating, now I'm feeling it in my glute on this side and hip flexor on this side.
You don't have to have your leg physically propped up like that. It's probably better, to be honest. But to be, if you just have your knees down like this, you can, depending on the length of your arms, sometimes you might just need your head propped up a little bit, but you can still push down with this one and up with this one as well. It is definitely a little bit better, ideally, to have the leg propped up while you're doing it, though.
Just so you can reach and actually relax your shoulders.
Yep. Another technique we'll show real quick. I think the first time I learned this, they call it a shotgun. So pretty much we're gonna create a force pushing outwards with from both knees, you do that a few times and then a rapid switch to pushing inwards with both. So push out into my hands. And this one, it is okay to do a much larger effort. It's not like the other one. And relax. Push out again. Cool. Push in my hands. Relax. Cool. And some people actually have the knees separate a little bit more over time. I don't really think I've found a preference here, and I don't think I've actually had it explained as to why they had that preference. But just to show for, video's sake, push out, push in my hands, relax, cool, separate a little bit more, push out, again, relax, here you go, push out again, push out, again, relax, okay, push in, cool, and that's it.
So I typically have them use like a belt or something like that around your knees to push out into, and then you can use like a smaller ball, or you can use a yoga block or foam roll in between your knees to squeeze in. So that's how I teach people to do this at home.
But again, just going back to, repeat just for clarity, the first one where you're alternating up and down and up, sub-max effort, not pushing as hard as you can with the shotgun, or the second one where you're pushing out, 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 in, that one you actually do want to push harder for.
So you might be thinking, if the manipulation or adjustment does something short term, what can I do to actually change things long term, right? So that really is just exercise. So you want to improve the mobility of the back and the hips, and then you want to improve the strength and the firing of your glutes in all different ways.
I will say this real quick, that a lot of the research supports doing this immediately afterwards. So if you're wondering why it feels good for a little while, but there's a need to go back, say 2-3 times a week, and you're just really getting popped or just getting heat or ice or tent or stim, and you're wondering why it feels so good, but then it comes right back. So you start thinking, hey, what's wrong with me? There's nothing wrong with you. It's the approach that you're utilizing to get better, where the most beneficial time to do the exercise is paired with that, right? Remember what I said earlier, I kind of explained to my patients like a permission slip. If we use those manipulations or those quick stretches, it's a permission slip for your body to now feel comfortable using those muscles and moving those joints in a new position that it hadn't been comfortable with. But again, a permission slip doesn't take you to the party, it just allows you to get to the party, right? So that's how I explain it to my patients, and that's the way you should be looking at doing some of these things. Just getting popped itself typically is not enough for people to have a long-term impact, and the research supports that. When you combine it with muscle activation and stretching and strengthening, etc., then you'll find a lot more research supporting it long-term.
And there are a ton of different examples of exercises that you can do depending on what's appropriate for you, where you are at that point in time, and your level and range of motion and what you actually need. So we're going to show you a couple examples of different things, but by all means, this is not an end-all be-all for these things.
So first we'll start with just some easy back stretches. These are some of Laura's favorites. If you follow her, you've probably seen some of these online before. Average person will probably try to support the head with a pillow or two as they're doing it, but there's a bunch of different variations. I'm sure you've seen it. This is definitely one that we have people that sometimes they'll say their back pops while you do it, and that's one of the reasons that people love this one. They also like because they can do it, in bed. So first thing in the morning, when they're in bed at night. Another one that she does, this one I will say I'm a bit more judicious with who to use it for. If you're feeling that pinch in your back, you're probably just not there yet. But this is a rotation one on your stomach actually to twist it. And another one that we'll do, especially if there's pinching there, like I said, that one's a bit more advanced, is just what we call lower trunk rotations. It's real simple, just bringing in the knees from side to side. If you want to bias the back a little bit more, keep your feet and your knees together. If you want to bias hip motion a little bit more, you just separate them a little bit and do the same thing. There's another way you can do that. We'll do the IR/ER rockers next. This is one of your favorites probably.
So essentially I'm creating a 90-90 position. So my hip is bent to 90 degree, my knee is bent to 90 degree, and I'm just rocking from side to side. A lot of people, they can't necessarily, or they don't have this range of motion to come up here without using their hands. So I'll have them lean back and just rock from side to side. And as you get more motion, then you can sit up a little bit more as you're doing this, and then eventually not use your hands at all. This really just works the rotation of the hips.
And another way to loosen up the hips is a simple piriformis stretch. So you can just get on your back. There's really a few different ways we can do this. She's going to go straight to the most advanced one. Obviously, she does a lot more from a mobility standpoint than the average person. Now we're just doing rockers. That's It's kind of one that I like the most, either rocking side to side this ways, depending on who you ask, or just rocking the knee back and forth this ways. Again, are we looking for a prolonged stretch here where we're trying to loosen the muscle up, or are we just trying to bring it back and forth through range of motion and warm it up? Just depends on what your goal is. Definitely the knee to the chest one is definitely a little bit more progressed than most people we see in the clinic when it's a more acute or chronic pain, but that's definitely something where over time as you gain your mobility you might go to, or if something that you have that mobility up front, that's perfectly fine to do. Getting beyond the stretching and speaking more from an activation standpoint, just while you're in that position, we'll show a simple bridge. This is one where there's a bunch of different ways you can progress this. I think that the main thing to emphasize here is it's not really that important early on what progression you're doing. It's more how are we sequencing it? Are we firing through the hips? Are we feeling it in the back? Are we arching our back while we do it? Or are we keeping the core tucked, the belt line tucked down? And just really where you're feeling it is what I'd say. The more further out your feet are, the more you'll feel your hamstrings activating. The further up your knees are, the more you'll feel your glutes firing.
So with that, if your feet are too close, you might feel it in the front of your thighs to make it a stretch. So you really want your heel to be directly over top of or underneath your knee when you do lift up. And that should be about where you feel it the most in your glutes, really tucking the hips under, squeezing your butt, keeping the ribs down. And it's not necessarily as high as you can go with it, because then you're going to get it in my back. It's more, where do you feel it in the glutes the most, and really squeezing the hips at the top.
Yeah, and in that position, we can do hips up and bringing a leg up towards the sky if we want to. We can do even, I've done like times with bands where you wrap it around your knees and you go out from there. I mean, you could do it with you squeezing a ball in between. You can do it with, you see she just did her leg straighten out. Like I said, there's a million different progressions and variations you can find. But I think the most important thing is, can you just do the basic one? Me personally, I like to combine it when I'm doing it, where I'll do the figure 4 as I do the bridge. But again, it's where am I at and can I control the motion and not recreate my symptoms? Otherwise, it really doesn't matter how good the exercise is in terms of what someone else thinks or how cool it looks. If it's not done right and if it's not pain-free, it means you're probably trying to sequence too many things together and your back and your body's just not ready for it yet. Then sideline position is definitely another one of the more common positions we'll use, and she'll show you just a few of the variations that she likes to use.
I typically will start with like a basic clamshell. This is commonly done in physical therapy. So just lifting the hips up. A lot of people will then rock back. You want to keep your hips stacked on top of each other and hip still. So I'll sometimes have people keep their hand on their hip to prevent it from rocking back, and you're squeezing your hip to lift up. Feet are staying still. You can progress this with a band, and then you can progress this even more to get a little bit more core into a modified side plank. And then you can even add like an iso clamshell, now lifting your hip or your foot and your knee at the same time. So those are common ways that I will progress those, laying down on your side, and then you can even progress this a little bit more with a band that's standing up as well. So if you had a band around your knee, you're doing a little bit more of a hip hinge position. So this is more working towards a functional pattern, because you're now standing up and you're going to hinge the hips a little bit. You're going to have a band around your knees and you're just going to go out and in, and this is the only thing that's moving. My hips are staying still and going out and in, and again the band is around your knees.
Another thing you can do with the sideline clamshell, if you're really struggling with it, is that you're back up against a wall and then you don't have a choice because you can't open up your hips. That's just one that some people will find is helpful, because then you really get that feedback if you're pushing into it.
So if you are interested in more hip exercises, I do have a hip prehab program that I will link below for you, or I do have a follow along hip strengthening workout that only uses bands. So if you do want to check that out, I will go ahead and link that up there for you. But if you do have any questions, go ahead and drop them below.